Hey guys, Chris at The Ultimate Recycler. I've extended one of my little worm farm testing bays, and what we've got is this one you've probably seen over and over and over again, and I've done lots of tests in that, and the most recent one was a bucket full of orange peel, and now I've dug it all over, got some plant roots out of there. There was a few worms in there, but it's been a good testing bay. This area next to it had a pallet over it. It's been basically just part of the yard. All I've done is extend the bricks out, and I've dug it over. I've had it watered a couple of days so that it's sort of softened it up. You can see where I've dug it over, I've used a digging fork and it's brought up lumps of clay. So when you get down about 4 inches or so, there's quite a bit of clay here, and also there's quite a bit of charcoal or black ash, and I suspect there may have been a decent fire here. This is a very old building, and it's possible that there was a fire here many years ago, or maybe it was a pit where they burnt stuff. Don't know. But anyway, it's going to be used as a comparison test bed to this one. And the difference is, and what's brought this test on, is that I pondered in a recent video that because I've been doing test after test after test in these beds, and there's a couple of other beds here too, over probably a couple of years, and most of the tests have been various foods, so they're all nitrogen rich stuff, and the worms seem to be a lot less in population now coming in. So I'm wondering if those beds have built up too many nutrients or something that's not that agreeable with the worms. So we're going to use some apples. I've got 2 buckets of apples here off a tree over the road. I've just picked them up off the ground. I'm going to run them through my mulcher so that they're a nice pulp, and I'll spread some in this bed, and I'll spread some in this bed, and just see if it makes any difference as to the quantity of worms that come in to eat them, because I know worms like apples, and I've done an apple test before a long time ago, and I'll link it. And to make this test a little bit more interesting as well, it was suggested to me that because I've done a lot of nitrogen foods, that I should put some carbon in and do some paper tests, and that might change the microbes and the different bacteria, and it could alter how many worms come in. So I've got a box of shredded paper as well. So what I'm going to do is half of this new bed will be shredded paper and half will be mulched apples, and exactly the same in this old bed, and we'll just monitor it. We'll check it each week for a little while and see if there's any marked difference in worm activity, and just see if it's made a difference using a fresh area rather than the area that's been used a lot. And the paper might also add another dimension. So after that extremely long introduction, I'll better get to and mulch up some apples. Right, there we have it. It was almost 2 buckets full of apples. I did have to slice the bigger ones up to get through the mulcher. They weren't very good apples. They were bruised, and there was some bugs in some of them, and if you had bought them at a market, you would have taken them back, or you wouldn't have bought them in the first place. But I'm sure the worms won't complain. So there's quite a lot there. We're going to get a fairly substantial test. I've already put some paper on the other side, so now I'll spread the apples out. And there we have, equally distributed between the 2 plots. They're quite thick, so as usual, when I have a fairly thick layer of food, of nitrogen, it's going to heat up a bit. But that's fine. We're not worried about the time this takes. We're more interested in see if there's a difference between the 2 samples. It will also be interesting to see if the worms get into the paper quicker, or which disappears first. So anyway, there's our test all ready. I'll put the carpet mats over each. I'll keep them damp. We'll check them in a week's time. I'm sure the apples will be mouldy. Not sure what's going to happen with the paper. We might just spray a little bit of water on that first, just to dampen it down, because it will wick a bit of the moisture out of the soil. And then we'll come back in a week's time. Okay, time to check in on these 2 plots. It's been exactly 7 days. I hope you've all had a good week. It's a bit windy here at the moment. It's been a very hot day. I haven't watered these today, but I've been watering them each day. So let's see what's going on. Yep. Well, the apple's mouldy, as expected. The paper's nice and damp. So even though it's been fairly hot, the carpet does help keep the moisture down. Sorry, that keeps the moisture from evaporating. I'm not going to expect any worms to be in here yet. Just having a bit of a check. Okay, it looks nice and damp. So yeah, I didn't expect anything to happen in the first week. Let's have a look at the other bed. Looks much the same. Slightly flatter. This is a heavier piece of carpet, but otherwise exactly the same. It's mouldy, it's still damp, no sign of any worms. Alright, so everything's going evenly at this stage. We'll check it next week and we might see some activity by then. Another week has flown by. Time to check the apple and paper test. And our apple's gone black. There's a big worm straight up. So I thought we'd get some activity. And there's a worm over there on the paper. Where's my little rake? Okay, so it's looking like it's breaking down more. It's gone quite black. The mold's disappeared. And it's very sludgy. There's worms down below. We had quite a bit of rain the other day. It was a very wet day. And it looks like there's some springtails in there. So that's all starting to break down nicely. And the worms are just getting into it. I would think next week we're going to see a huge increase in population of worms. Now the paper when it gets wet tends to form a bit of a mat. And we can't see, there's a worm on top there. Perhaps he's just reclining reading the paper. Oh, there's some under there. Look at that, nice big fat juicy ones. But not enormous amounts of activity yet. But that's alright. Now we'll check the other one for a comparison. And pretty well the same conditions right next door, but fresh soil. Now there's still a little bit of mould on this apple. Do we have any worms here? Couldn't see any. No, can't really see any there yet. What about in the paper? It looks to be in much the same state of decay. Oh, there's a worm across there. Yep. Just catching up on the form guide perhaps. Alright, so there's not much activity there, but it's much the same. The apples still show a little bit of mould here, but they look pretty well the same as far as being quite wet and sludgy. But we can't really see any worms under this one. Alright, so we'll check it in another week's time and just see if there's any difference. At this stage they're both tracking about the same, I'd say. Another week down, let's see where we're up to with this apple and paper test. And oh, we've got lots of worms going on in here, and look at them on the paper. Alright, so that's good. I thought we'd see an increase in activity. Let's have a bit of a dig around. There's plenty on top in amongst that apple. Oh yeah, there's some underneath. And there's springtails in here. Looks like there's yep, plenty under there too. There's a really, really diverse lot of life in here. All eating away and decomposing and whatever they do with regards to the food. Now, there's some good worms on top of the paper. Let's have a look underneath. I mentioned last time the paper forms a bit of a mat. It tends to go very thin. Can't see so many underneath, but they're I guess with paper the worms can just sit on top. They don't really need to wait for it to break down so much, not like food where it may get hot and they stay underneath until it becomes more agreeable. But they're certainly getting into the paper, so no problems there. Okay, so let's check the other test bed and see if it's going along similar lines. Okay, we have a worm on top there, so they've grown into the apples here. Not quite as many. The apple's pretty thick here. It's really gone sludgy, but we're not seeing the worms underneath as we are in the other plot, which is interesting. Let's go over here and check the paper. No, it's not so many in there either. Now, perhaps, I mean, there's a lot of variables in this experiment, and it's possible that this is still a heavier clay and the worms just don't like travelling through it as much as they do through the other garden bed, which has built up a really thick layer of castings and it's really turned into nice soil, whereas this is still quite hard to rake through, even though I dug it before we started the experiment, and you can see the clay there. So not really much activity in this bay. So what I was thinking a fresh garden bed might encourage more worms, we're actually seeing the opposite, and that maybe could be because of the hard clay. So yep, alright, well we'll leave it another week and we'll check back then, but we are starting to see a bit of a difference. This bed seems to be much more agreeable than this bed. Let's get an update on this test. It's been another week. I've been fairly consistent lately with my checking, and we have plenty of activity here. Oh, look at the worms in there. I told you they like apples. And the paper doesn't seem to have as much activity. And guess what? I forgot to get my scratcher. I better go and find it. Okay, I found it. I swear it walks away when no one's looking and hides somewhere. So we have lots of good, juicy, thick, healthy worms here. The apples have pretty well just turned to a black sludge, not particularly thick. There's worms underneath. So that's all good. No issues there. Oh yeah, look, good worms underneath. And the paper, now we disturbed it a bit last time scratching around. Doesn't appear to have been much happening. I mean, I know they eat paper and they will eat it, but they seem to be much more interested in the apple at this stage. Anyway, we'll leave that there and we'll check the other bed. Now that was the existing bed that I've used for many years. This one is the new area. And it looks much the same, but we're not seeing the worms. It's gluggy and black. Oh, actually, look at that. It hasn't decayed as much. Oh, there's a worm there. Maybe it was just a bit thicker there, because it does look much the same. It's just a black sludge. But we have got hardly any worms in here. That's really interesting. So this experiment, oh hang on, before we hypothesize on what's going on, let's check the paper. Doesn't seem to be too much going on there either. I can't see any worms there. We've scratched it around a lot over the last few weeks, but there's no worms there. So okay, what's happening? Well, the experiment's essentially a failure in that I was expecting the fresh area to be much more active with worms, because I was supposing that the old bed was a bit stale in some respects as far as the worms go, but they've been flying into this apple here, and the area where I thought they might have come in more, I found one, didn't I think? And I think there is a larger amount of apple still here. So it's the opposite to what I expected. There's a worm there. Perhaps it's the clay, although if we dig down far enough here we have clay as well. Perhaps it's the extra charcoal and ash that's in this soil in this spot. Maybe this spot was used to empty the wood stove out of the kitchen, because I think they would have originally had a wood stove. They certainly had open fires in this place back in the early days. So maybe the charcoal has created a different pH or something. But then it's hard to believe that would vary just over a metre. The only difference is that this one has built up a lot over the last few years, and I have actually shoveled it out once or twice. So we've created a lot of worm castings, and it's obviously more depth there of nicer soil than what we've got here. Alright, so we'll wind this up. It's an experiment without really any conclusions, but it was an interesting one to do. If nothing else, we've shown that the worms do like apples, but we knew that anyway. I might do some tests. I might leave these garden beds actually sit out for some time, and I'll do some more tests in other areas where we seem to have larger worm populations. If you have any theories or any suggestions, it'd be much appreciated. Leave some comments down below. In the meantime, Enjoy your worms. We'll see you next time.